Hello, my name is Dean Radin. I'm the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. My talk today is, was Buddha just a nice guy? And the question will become a little clearer as we go further into the talk. So the underlying question is, what is the nature of consciousness? And there are three ways of thinking about it. One way is the standard neuroscience approach, which is that consciousness is generated by the brain. This idea comes about because when you look inside the body and you try to find where consciousness lives, you're naturally drawn to the brain. But when you look inside the brain, you see a lot of interesting mechanical and energetic processes, but you don't see consciousness at all. So the reason why neuroscientists are very convinced that consciousness comes out of the brain is because there are different portions of the brain that are associated with fairly subtle things like theory of mind or ethics and the morality of oneself. If you take a scalpel and you scoop away those portions of the brain, people may not have a theory of mind and they may not be as ethical or moral. So we can make the correlation between brain processing and things that we associate with consciousness. Another possibility, and by the way, this possibility can be drawn or sketched in this form, that here's an object, it's the brain. Somehow, by some means, consciousness arises, and the underlying image basically is that we're sort of like robots. We're mechanistic computers that give rise to an illusion of consciousness. This is the prevailing view in science today. Another possibility is that the brain activity reflects consciousness. The consciousness is more fundamental, and the brain is somehow being a filter or a reflection of consciousness. It comes out of this tradition, the contemplative traditions, where if you sit down long enough and you simply meditate, you don't come to the conclusion that you're your brain. You come to the conclusion that consciousness is the essence of you in some important way. So that gives rise to this sort of a picture, where again you have the same object, but the question now is, well, who's watching? Who's behind the screen there? And in this case, you have something like this. You have a picture of some person you might think of as yourself, but that self is not the brain. It's watching it from outside. It's consciousness from the outside. A third possibility is closer to the notion of energy medicine, where people throughout history have reported various kinds of energies located in different portions of the body. Here, science doesn't know what to do with this at all. From a mainstream perspective, ideas about chakras and energetic flows in the body are still pretty much at the point of mythology. Nevertheless, a lot of people report it. So something is going on that is outside the purview of science at the moment. We hope that will change soon. Well, given that we live in a secular Western world, people, when they think of these ideas, these ancient concepts of miracles having to do with energetics, here we have a picture of Buddha ensconced in flame and levitating over his disciples. Here we have Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea. And here we have Jesus walking on water. For people who come from a religious tradition, these are literal. People who come from a scientific tradition, we look at that and say, well, we're not quite so sure. Maybe Moses parted the Red Sea and it was a fluke. Or maybe I'm glad my name's not thou. Or perhaps here we have a picture of either the Mona Lisa or Jesus or Mother Mary somehow magically appearing in a grilled cheese sandwich. This particular sandwich was purchased by a casino in Las Vegas and is shown in a display case there today. And the miracle underneath it is not simply that there's an impression of an image, but also that the grilled cheese sandwich is incorruptible. It hasn't decayed. So that is proof that it is then divine in some way. Or if you're too busy to meditate, you can try the Buddha patch, achieve enlightenment while cleaning your toilet. also available in capsule, gel, and suppository. And of course, my favorite is this one: if there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? So that's pretty much the way that Western science and media have treated these kinds of questions. Was Buddha just a nice guy? Which we can cast into a more personal form. Was Siddhartha, the man, just a nice guy? Was he the George Clooney of the day? He had a good smile and he knew how to work a crowd? Or was there something else going on? And that's really the underlying question here. Was he just a nice guy? Or was he more than just a nice guy? So this question actually came up in discussions with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama for years has been holding discussions with scientists to talk about Buddhist principles and ideas and Western science ideas. And occasionally the question would arise: was Buddha just a nice guy? From a Western science perspective, that's all he could be. There's no other possibility. And that's not so bad, because from a science perspective, lots of books, lots of new research came about because the Dalai Lama's gravitas made it possible for a neuroscientist to do studies on meditation and showing how it affects the brain. Now, the assumption underneath this is, again, that it's all about the brain, and that's all it can be. This still has had some value because these books are now popular, but it's completely missing the important question underneath it. Are we really talking about supernormal abilities as divine gifts, or maybe latent human potentials, or something else? So the picture here is an illustration in my book, Supernormal, and the picture of the lady there, her name is Selma Sirek, she's the illustrator. So I'm giving her some credit there for making some nice pictures. So at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, it's the supernormal question that we study as, from a scientific perspective, was Buddha just a nice guy or something more? If you look at this whole general question from a Western perspective, we see evolution kind of in this fashion. We start from proto-humans, we become humans who have a little bit too much fast food, and then we're devolving into something else. Okay, so here's the Western science perspective on evolution. And here then is a more positive viewpoint from the yogic perspective. So from the yogic perspective, it's actually similar in that we started with proto-humans, we became humans roughly 4,000 BC. Sometime in 2525, we will learn to hover. And 7,000 years later, we'll learn to fly. So this is more along the lines that what we currently think of as supernormal is actually part of the evolution of humanity. So maybe we won't be Homo sapiens at that point, as it kind of says here at the top, will be Homo siddhas, or Homo superior, where we learn how to use these natural capacities. So the reason why I selected yoga as a way to address the issue of what are our actual potentials is because we know that it's mainstream now. And we know that because it's on the cover of Time magazine. And this is already 14, 15 years ago that yoga was recognized as being part of Western popular culture. And again, actually, a lot of that can be traced back to the Dalai Lama, even though there have been many, many studies by transcendental meditation researchers starting in the 1960s. But it took a long time for this to reach a level of popular culture. In addition, because it's now acceptable to study these kinds of issues, there are many, many studies looking at yoga and meditation and their effects on health, in which case, if for treatment of everything from carpal tunnel to back pain to PTSD in veterans, depression, insomnia, and many other things, yoga and meditation are clinically effective. And actually, some places now will pay for these kinds of treatments by insurance. So the methods work. Methods are thousands of years old. What else does yoga tell us? Well, the classic book of yoga is the Yoga Sutras, written by an Indian sage named Patanjali, roughly 2,000 years ago. It consists of 4 little books containing a total of 196 sutras or aphorisms or little short sentences. So those 4 little books basically are talking about samadhi. Samadhi is a form of deep absorption, which we might think of as the first stage in the mystical experience, the stage of unity. That's what it's all about. Along the way to developing this very deep form of meditation are what's called the siddhis, which is a Sanskrit term meaning perfection or attainment. The siddhis we would think of in modern terms as various forms of psychic ability. There's a whole book that Patanjali devotes to the siddhis. It's the 3rd book, and he talks about development of things like telepathy and precognition as part of a process called samyama. So you do concentration, meditation, and samadhi along with an object of attention. What that means is that once you're in this deeply absorbed unity state, if you place your attention on something, anything, in a sense, you become that thing. So if you put your attention on another person, you become that person. You know that person as well or better than you know yourself. And that can manifest in the form of telepathy because you know them. So the siddhis, roughly 25 siddhis are mentioned by Patanjali. They fall into 3 categories. These are all exceptional forms of psychic ability. So in the mind-body area, we're talking about ability to heal oneself to a much greater degree than usual. Inedia means not having to eat or drink anything. Super strength, super speed, levitation, which is becoming extremely light, or gravitation, which is the opposite, becoming extremely heavy. In clairvoyance, this involves perception through space and time, from the very microscopic to the macroscopic, all the way up to the entire cosmos. And psychokinesis is direct forms of mind over matter. So it's true that levitation, maybe super strength, super speed are kinds of mind over matter, except that I put it into the category of mind-body because those siddhis have to do with yourself. Whereas psychokinesis, if you levitated somebody else, that would be a psychokinetic effect. Most of the siddhis, roughly 20 of the 25 siddhis, are variations of clairvoyance. And interestingly, the same siddhis are found in all cultures. As I mentioned, in yoga, they're called siddhis. In Catholicism, they're called charisms. In Islam, they're called karamats. You find it in Judaism, Tibetan Buddhism, all shamanic traditions. All languages on earth have names for these kinds of abilities. So this is not something new. We call them psychic abilities in the modern world, but they have been known basically since history has been recorded. So what do we do with this? One way of then examining this in more detail, given the world that we live in today, is to say, well, Sutra in book number 3, 19 and 20, talk about knowledge of minds. Today we would call that telepathy. Is that real, or was Patanjali simply writing a fantasy? So the way we would test it today is through a technique called the Ganzfeld method, which you take the person who will be the receiver of telepathic information, put them in a shielded room so that no external information can reach them. You put a half of a ping pong ball over each eye, you tape it down, you shine a red light in their face and you ask them to relax. And you also have headphones that they put over their ears so they can't see anything, they can't hear anything. And if they're in a sufficiently comfortable chair, they can't really feel anything either. After a few minutes in that condition, most people will begin to go into a hypnagogic state where their brain or their mind becomes starved for some kind of imagery because their eyes are open, they're awake, and yet nothing's happening. So it makes people exquisitely sensitive to any subtle impressions that they may pick up. And that's, of course, what you want somebody to be in that state when they're in a telepathy experiment. So you put the receiver of the experiment in this state. Meanwhile, at a distance, you have a sender, typically a friend or a family member, who makes a random decision of 4 possible pictures. So in this case, the receiver and the sender both had no idea what these pictures were. These 4 pictures were face down in an envelope. We gave a die to the sender. He rolled the die. He picked one of the 4 images at random and selected one, and then tried to mentally send that to the receiver. The receiver is asked to speak aloud, because it's partially to keep the receiver awake, because you can imagine it'd be easy to fall asleep in that condition. And anything that the receiver then says while they're during this sending period is recorded, so they can play it back to them later. So this is what the receiver said in this one trial. With these as the 4 possible pictures, the sender is sending one of these 4 pictures. Something has a rough texture, tall, looking up high, like in an art gallery or a museum, a Yosemite kind of image of a tall rock, monolithic, images of Mount Rushmore, half dome, like a big stone. So if you were a judge in this experiment and you saw that this is what the receiver said, and you knew that one of the 4 pictures is the actual picture that was being sent telepathically, you would have to decide, which one do I think is the correct one? Well, the chance of guessing correctly is 1 in 4 if you had no other information. Given what the receiver said in this case, you probably would guess this. And in fact, this was what the sender was trying to send in this example. So this would be called a hit. It's a hit with odds against chance of 1 in 4. So 1 in 4 is not going to convince anybody of anything. So we do this experiment again and again. So as of a couple of years ago, there have been 122 published experiments conducted over about 40 years by 20 different laboratories with 4,674 sessions of the type where I just described to you one session. The dotted line shows where chance is. And to better appreciate where our overall result was as compared to chance, I'm going to show you the same chart in a cumulative form, where chance is again the dotted line, but you can see that cumulatively over many, many sessions, we actually end up at 32% on this graph there. And this finding, of course, the odds against chance are very far away from chance. This has been published in the psychological literature many times. And because the odds against chance are 300 trillion quadrillion to 1, we're pretty sure that what's going on here is not a matter of chance. The next question is, well, then what is it? It was designed, remember, to look for telepathy. So we think it might be that. But it's also important to look at other possible explanations. So could it have been some form of sensory leakage from the sender to the receiver? Could it have been a recording mistake of what the receiver said? Maybe there was a randomization problem. Maybe. So lots of maybes here. The experiments have been designed in such a way as to close all known loopholes. So there are no maybes left. The next question, though, is even when you can exclude fraud on the part of the experimenter and on the part of the subjects, and the most recent studies do exclude fraud by having multiple checks and balances, what about the question of, well, can a skeptic get the same result? Because there's always a suspicion that if somebody's doing the experiment and they kind of believe telepathy to begin with, well, maybe they just made a mistake, or maybe they're not reporting it correctly. But a skeptic who really doesn't believe this, if they can get the same results, then it's more believable. Well, fortunately, in 2005, there were 2 professors, one at the University of Georgia and the other one at Notre Dame, who didn't believe in this at all, but went ahead and did the same kind of experiment. And they said, after 8 studies, we had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which is exactly what we've seen over 40 years. And that we know that's not chance. But they then went on to say that this was precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. And so they concluded, after conducting a single additional study of a new design, which no one had ever tried before, and that study did not show an effect, they said, well, I guess what we had done before must have been due to chance or something. So they dismissed even their own studies showing what everyone else had seen over 40 years. This tells us then that if you have an opinion already formed, a very strong opinion, then no amount of additional information or data or experiments will convince you otherwise. That this is simply part of human nature, and of course, you see it throughout much of science. But this study does allow us to say that if a skeptic does the same experiment that everyone else did, they're very likely to end up with a very similar result. So does that mean that telepathy is true? I think we can say that there is converging, repeatable evidence from many different labs over a long period of time that telepathy exists beyond a reasonable doubt. That means, are you not thinking what I'm not thinking? It basically means that Patanjali wasn't making it up. He was reporting things the way that they actually were. And let's consider another possibility here with mind-matter interaction. So here we're talking about not levitation and large-scale effects, because we generally don't see that in the laboratory. But what we do see in the laboratory is at the quantum scale, that observation, knowledge, and measurement changes the way that quanta behave. Quantum mechanical effects behave differently if you're looking at them than if you're not looking at them. So this gives rise to an experiment. We know that if you're not paying attention to, and you don't measure which of two slits a photon goes through, you get an interference pattern, certain clumpiness of the photons. But if you do look, you know or measure where a photon goes through two slits, then you get a very different pattern. You get what's called a diffraction pattern. So this suggests that maybe you can do an experiment using an optical double slit system where all you do is ask somebody to put their mind's eye, not their physical eye, but their mind's eye, to imagine that they could see the photons as they go through the double slits. If it turns out that they can do that, it means that, and they can actually see or gain information about where the photons are going, it will do what is called collapse the wave function. It'll cause the quantum potential to turn into a quantum actual, and the interference pattern will look different. So we've done experiments like that using equipment of this sort. The interferometer is inside the box, and the laser tube is sticking out the end. Here I am working on the inside of the box. So we did many experiments. We've actually done now 16 experiments, and this is showing 6 of them, involving 250 test sessions with over 100 people. And there are 2 types of conditions. Observed is when you have people doing the experiment. And the observing means that they're mentally trying to see what's happening at a distance inside a sealed box. When they do that, the behavior of the system progressively gets further and further away from chance. And unobserved means that there's nobody around, but you're just running the system all by yourself. So that's like a control condition. And under those conditions, the further along you get, actually the closer to chance you end up. So this study showed that if you then separate people who have training of attention training, meaning meditators in this case, versus people who don't have attention training, non-meditators, that most of the action in the experiment is due to the meditators. They're much, much better at this task. So, in fact, almost odds of 300,000 to 1 for the meditators. So this allows us to then think back on what Patanjali was trying to tell us, that if you sit down and meditate long enough and you achieve a certain degree of adeptness in your practice, that you can do things which, from a conventional point of view, seem impossible. And yet, here's an experiment looking at the interaction between mind and light at the quantum scale, and we see that actually mind can do things similar to what Patanjali was saying. So let's see, let's go on to this next question then. Well, what about the other cities? Because Patanjali talked about 26 cities, and so far I've only mentioned 2. Well, this is one of the topics I talk about in great gory detail in my latest book, Supernormal. But it brings us back to this question of, was Buddha just a nice guy? And I would say then that after looking at what Patanjali wrote 2,000 years ago, and by the way, at that time, what he was writing about was an oral tradition which had persisted for thousands of years. This is the first written form of the oral tradition. So this is a very, very long legacy. Looking at that in great detail, what we find is that Patanjali probably was explaining and describing things as best as he could at the time. So here I'm going to pause and then I'm going to pick it up again and talk about this in a little bit more detail.